For me, it was utter and sheer anger and humiliation. I wasn't embarrassed that I had a period. I was humiliated that I was considered less than or not good enough just because my body was doing what it was meant to do. The law does say that a woman's value is that of half of a man. And this is Islamic law according to the interpretation. We are temptations to men. It is the woman's fault because she is providing that temptation. Not only was I visually a temptation, but so was my voice. If I were to speak in public, my voice was considered as blasphemy. So the minute a woman starts covering and menstruating, that's when she then becomes a temptation to men. Everywhere I went, I had to be veiled. The moment I would leave the confines of our home to any other place until I got to another place where there were only women. And so that was kind of the start of like, oh, I guess my childhood is over. I guess now I am officially becoming invisible. In the hottest desert of the world, to be covered from head to toe just made no sense. It was suffocating. And I could not talk about it. Prior to me plotting all of this, there have been attempts that other young women have tried to escape. And the minute they got caught at the airport, they were sent back to their families. Some of them, honor killings were very much a thing. And in other cases, they just became prisoners of their own home. And so for me, I had to get really, really creative in finding ways to get that permission without him knowing what my ultimate plan was.
Hey, my name is Shelise and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening and you want to see our faces, go to our YouTube channel. It's so awesome when you guys can like and subscribe and interact with the post. It really helps boost it to more people so others can become aware of these stories, your survivor stories, become advocates as well. And we just really appreciate seeing those words of encouragement for our guests who are sharing their stories. So today's guest, she reached out to us through our Jot form, which you can find in our About section if you are interested in becoming a guest on the show. She has written a book called The Last Sandstorm, which is a memoir about her life growing up as an Italian, Arab, and now American in Saudi Arabia, and how she was the first documented woman to escape Saudi Arabia without legal ramifications, and we'll get into more about what that means. So we are going to talk more about her life and everything that she had to endure growing up. So thank you so much for joining us, Jasmin Faulk-Dickerson.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here. I'm excited.
Yeah, we have so much to talk about, and your book was so beautifully written. Well done. I'm kicking myself for not being able to finish it before this recording, but we wanted to get this recorded sooner than later, so I'm definitely looking forward to going back and reading all of it, of course. Basically, what I find really interesting is how you kind of grew up with this dichotomy of cultures, and we're going to get into what that meant for you growing up, but essentially your mom was or is Italian, and then you have your dad who grew up in Saudi Arabia. And so I'm curious about how they came together and how this culmination happened.
Yeah, so definitely complex. So I always preface and say that I am the lucky or also challenged child of the first generation of children in Saudi Arabia who were products of non-fully Saudi marriages. What that means is when my dad was born, the recent iteration of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was just pretty brand new. And prior to that, there were, lots of historic context. I won't get into that, but a lot of different areas and tribes and regions. And so for the united part of the kingdom, it was really recently founded right around the time my dad was born, which was late 1930s. When my dad was in his early 20s, late teens, early 20s, he and a group of other very bright, intelligent Saudi men showed promise for building the country and sort of creating this new generation of very highly educated Saudi young men. And they were sent abroad to educate themselves and to kind of bring back everything they've learned from different parts of the world and build this brand new country. And this was before oil was, or right around the time that oil was found. So there was wealth coming into the country and this huge promise. And so my dad, along with a group of other friends, based on the choice of their field of study, which for my dad, it was architecture and interior design, was sent to Italy, of course, the capital of the world of art. And so there he was sent. Some of the other young men went to India to study medicine. Others went to the US for technology, and France and England. I mean, depending on the area of the field of interest that they were exploring, that's where they were sent. So my dad landed in Florence, where my mom is from. My mom was raised in Florence, grew up in Florence all her life, very Italian young woman of the 1960s. And at a party they met, and my mom was not supposed to be at that party either, because my grandfather was a very strict Italian man. And so they met at this party, fell in love, and I say the rest is history because I do go into details in the book. But basically, their decision was to, my dad to finish his education, then go back to Saudi Arabia and basically start a family there, not ever imagining that there was something kind of odd and bizarre about it, because there was no standard or any example for them to look up to, or for us as children to look up to, of who had done it before and what that looks like to be children of a very, very modern, liberal, basically capital of the world, a country like Italy, and from Europe, from the old world of so much rich history and so much progressive democracy. And then Saudi Arabia, not only a newly founded country, but also a very deeply conservative, traditional, religious part of the world that up until that point, not many around the world knew anything about. So that's kind of laying the foundation of what that looked like growing up.
Yeah. And you talk about in your book how at one point your mom almost said, never mind, because she's like, wait, what am I getting myself into? But was it just the love for your dad that kept her going and had her decide to officially go back with him?
Yeah, so I think my mom has more of an adventure spirit than she will ever want to admit. I think she had a curiosity to explore, different parts of the world, and she's very, very intellectually bright and curious. And so I think there was part of that a challenge for her, but also there was kind of an intrigue and a curiosity. I'd like to assume that, the love that my parents had for each other was the reason why she felt really drawn to committing to this adventure. And honestly, she even says now that she had no idea what she was getting herself into, but she did not necessarily regret it or resent it. She actually loved the life that she ended up building for herself in Saudi Arabia. As the woman that was raised in the West, she had no issue with the changes and the adjustments. It was more so myself growing up as a young teenage girl and a young woman, and seeing the polar opposite worlds, and just innately knowing that I wanted something different or something more. And also I had a lot more maybe thrust upon me as a young Arab girl, in the expectation, and my father wanting to prove to society that he did do the right choice, and that he could raise proper Saudi children and young, Saudi women and Arab kids, and that even with our progressive educated approach and stance in society, we could still be very adhered to the society cultural norms. And so my mom did not necessarily have the same pressures I did.
That makes sense. So I know something that we wanted to discuss so that we're not also blanket statementing or putting blame where it shouldn't. We wanted to discuss the difference between culture, race, religion, ethnicity, and everything that surrounded your childhood and your mom's life as well.
Yeah, that is one particular topic that I never thought I'd be talking about perpetually and nonstop, and that I would actually have the need to explain so often. So the part of the world that I come from does not really concern itself very much with the nuances and the details that the United States seems to be really concerned about. There tends to be a lot of focus here around race, understandably, because the history of the United States was built a lot on those kind of problematic, histories, or, we won't go into that detail, but obviously race played a huge part in how the United States founded itself, starting from the indigenous communities to obviously slavery. I don't want to speak on behalf of the rest of the world, but I can tell you where I grew up, I never ever remember talking about race ever. They talk about race in a very different context. It's more about your heritage, your tribal connections, your sometimes origins. There's definitely a lot of prejudice around your origins as an Arab or as a non-Arab, as a Saudi, as a pure tribal person, as a non-tribal person. So there's conversations around that. But what I do know is that, again, growing up and studying, and my mom is deeply educated and, raised us with a lot of really strong knowledge and did not just depend on what we were learning at school, but race, ethnicity, and culture, and now we add religion and, citizenship. Those are all very, very different things. Race is really what you identify based on your, I guess, race. Growing up, there was like either African or Black, European or Caucasian, which that also stems beyond Europe, includes also a big part of the Middle East. And then you have Asia, which, is both East and Southeast Asia. And then now we also have an awareness around indigenous and tribal areas. So my racial identity was never in question. My parents both belonged to the same racial identity, which my dad was Middle Eastern, or was, because has passed away, but was Middle Eastern, my mom Italian, Southern Italian. But racially, we did not look like biracial children. We looked like bi-ethnic children. We came from two different ethnicities, i.e. the Arabs, and within the Arabs, there's lots of ethnicities. Within Europe, there's lots of ethnicities. Within really any kind of large community, there are different ethnicities. And then there's, of course, tradition, which impacts, what history has done with travel and with trade and all that. And then there's religion, which religion can change. It has no ties to your origin of nationality, of your racial or ethnic background. And so that was a shock to me when I came to this country, where people really wanted to pinpoint my racial identity. It was never anything I ever thought of. I have a very strong connection to my ethnic background. My mom Italian, my dad Arab, and I'm a bi-ethnic child, a bicultural child. But Arabs are not a race. They're a group of people that have different ethnicities and different races within them. You will meet Black Arabs, you will meet Asian Arabs, and you will meet Caucasian Arabs, not what America refers to as white, which we know only as Northern European or Western European. White falls under the category of the larger umbrella of Caucasian race. So I find myself having these conversations very often, because there is always this like either light bulb moment or aha moment where people are like, oh, and I appreciate and validate the need to really understand people so that we can, address discrimination and all that. But I've never had a problem with racism growing up ever. Quite the opposite. I was too white maybe for being in an area that was a lot more tan or a lot more olive. And I'm very olive. But my coloring actually comes probably more from my mother's side of the family, the Southern Italian heritage, as opposed to my father's, which is Northern Arab. And they are definitely a lot fairer than most Arabs that are in the central or southern part of the peninsula, if you will.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. And I think we wanted to kind of differentiate that because we wanted to talk about your upbringing in a way that doesn't discriminate or doesn't create, I don't know if Islamophobia is the right word to use here, or doesn't create bigotry, because we don't want to blanket statement a whole group of people. We just want to talk about the ways in which you grew up, talk about the foundation which you were a part of, the culture that you were a part of, and how that impacted you. So do you have anything else to add before we kind of get into those specifics?
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. That's really important. And that's the reason why I bring this up. It's not because I'm attached to any particular identity. Truly, I don't care how people see me or how they label me or how they identify me. That does not concern me to the least. What I do worry about is how it does paint that very broad brush. When people hear that someone is either Arab or Middle Eastern or Muslim, they immediately assume that they fall under this exact same category of labels, and it is not like that at all. It's actually quite the opposite and far from that. And so thank you for highlighting that. And my goal certainly is always to educate. I am an educator, and so even though my personal experience has had a lot of very traumatic and problematic and concerning experiences, it was my experience and does not necessarily reflect the experience of every single person that may have had a similar background to mine and or is living a very different life based on their choices or the circumstances in which they find themselves in. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah. Great. So then let's talk about what your specific upbringing looked like. What was the fabric of the culture that you grew up in specifically?
Yeah. So when I was growing up in the 1970s, I was a young child. And even though I was feeling like there was something weird and odd and different about my life and about my upbringing, I could tell my mom did not belong to the area like most of the other women. I could tell, and my mom learned how to speak fluent Arabic, by the way, but I could tell that when she spoke Arabic, she didn't sound like all the other women. And my dad was fluent in Italian. At home, we spoke Italian, but outside of the home, obviously, it was mostly Arabic. And I knew there was something different about us. My parents never brought it up. They never talked about it. They never sat us down. It was just who we were. And we were also in a pretty solid group and community of other families like us, you know, a lot of Saudi dads married to Italian moms. And so we had our little community as well. Since most of us were far away from our Italian families, our grandparents, our aunts, our uncles, our cousins. And so when we were in our little bubble, I felt like, okay, cool. Like we're all the same. But when I went out in society, I could tell that there was a huge difference. And so as a child, it didn't trouble me as much as I always worried that I was going to lose my mom because she didn't belong there. Totally irrational. But again, this is a child that's trying to reason with something that did not seem like the norm. And so I always worried about this. Any moment around the corner, I was going to lose my mom. This was until I hit my tween years, right before, you know, becoming a teenager. Then I started to really see how differently women were treated, what the laws were saying, what the expectations were, and just slowly started to notice that my existence was very, very obviously being kind of isolated and closed off and hidden. And there was no place for me to be out in public. And this is, again, as a tween child. So I knew something was really off. And so I struggled with feeling like I was becoming a woman in a society that did not necessarily see me and validate me at all. And this is not just the culture and the tradition, but the law as well, because the law does say that a woman's value is that of half of a man. And this is Islamic law according to the interpretation of the region. And this is a lot of Islamic countries that, you know, by law, a woman in an inheritance takes half of what a man gets. That if there was a crime and there was a witness, one man is the value of two women. So and this was said to us just very casually. This is just how it is. It wasn't like I'm schooling you and teaching you, or can you imagine this is how it is? It was just like, this is, and everyone around me seemed to be okay with it. I had a really hard time processing that.
Yeah. And you mentioned that the first time that you were told to do something that was specific to the culture was around 9 or 10 years old, right?
Yeah. So when young women develop and become, you know, young ladies, if you will, when you get your period, essentially is when you become a woman in society. And there's immediately the expectation of covering. You have to wear the abaya, the cape, the veil, covering your face, all of those things. So I went to a private school. It was it was girls and boys, but they were separated. They were not co-ed. So up until second grade, girls and boys were together, and then in the girls section. And then after second grade and third grade, the boys would move on to the boys section. So we were definitely separate. So at school, even though we wore uniforms and it was extremely traditional in that sense, long sleeves, long skirts, there was a monitor, a female, a woman on the women's side of the school that watched girls go in and out of the school every single day, every single girl that went in and out of the school. And she would assess when a girl started to look like she was developing or developed or a little too womanly.
Whoa.
And she would immediately point to the girl and say, tomorrow you come to school veiled, covered from head to toe. Like you are ready. Didn't matter if she got her period or not. It was just based on what she looked like. And so every day I would go in and out of the school, and my mom taught at the school. She was an English teacher at the school, and my sister went to school with me. And so I would always try to go in and out of the school, sort of hiding behind my mom and my sister, even though I was tall, but I was skinny. I did not want to be noticed because I was terrified that I would be called out. During this time, I also got my period. I was about 10. I got my period, and I did not disclose it to anyone because I knew that the minute it was out, I was now a woman. And even though, again, my parents have a very different kind of perspective on how they raise their daughters, they still have, you know, an obligation to society and an expectation. And this is during a time when society knew everything about everyone. So I did not disclose. I figured it out on my own in my own little 10-year-old self. It was not easy, but even my mother, who I was deeply close to, I did not disclose this to. And I went a whole year figuring it out, but no one knew that I had gotten my period and I was essentially developed. And then my sister, who's a year and a half younger than me, got her period the next year, obviously like clockwork. And, she was kind of excited. I mean, she's a lot more feminine and a lot more comfortable in her own kind of self in that way. And so she announced it and everyone was like, whoa, okay, well, I guess, yeah, I mean, Jasmine's a little skinny and underdeveloped and all that. And, but then I knew that my secret was going to run its course. And so the month after when I got my period, I was like, oh, me too. And so now we both got our periods. That same month we went to school. And that monitor lady that was watching all the girls going in and out saw my sister and pointed at my sister and said, okay, tomorrow you come veiled. She said nothing to me though. And I'm a year and a half older than her. So I got in the car and I was kind of relieved. I didn't want to rub it in because it was my sister. Get home. My mom says to my dad, it's time. May was my sister's May, and they told her she has to come veiled. And my dad goes, okay, well, we'll go shopping for the abaya, which is the cape, and the veil, and we'll get one for Jasmine too. And I was like, whoa, why? And he's like, well, you can't go around the older sister not covered when your younger sister has to cover. And so that was kind of the start of like, oh, I guess my childhood is over. I guess now I am officially becoming invisible in society because everywhere I went, I had to be veiled. The moment I would leave the confines of our home to any other place until I got to another place where there were only women, I had to be veiled all the time.
Okay.
This is age 11.
Can we talk about the significance of this? Because I'm wondering if this is specifically like a cultural thing, if it's a law thing, if it's just an expectation, if it's part of the society that you're in, like the bubble of a society, or was it just everywhere? That's how it was.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and it's important because people now have a very different vision and idea and impression of that part of the world. And it is a little different now. When I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, this was the law. It was the tradition. So it's a mixture of law, tradition, and religion. Mm-hmm. Some Muslim countries apply a very different approach to the Islamic teachings and laws. Some separate it a little bit. Some, create this perfect relationship between both tradition and religion. Saudi Arabia, like a couple of other countries in the region, went very, very deep, extreme application of both the religion, interpretation of the religion, but also tied to their cultural, tribal, and traditional values. And so it's really hard to decipher what influenced what, because prior to the 1970s, it was always a very conservative area, but there was also a lot more norms in terms of tradition. Bedouin women had some authority. They had matriarchal areas where they did the work. Or if you look back at history, also there were a lot of strong women in the area. Not as many as the West, of course, but there still is in history evidence that women were not always deeply submissive. I'm not sure what happened in that region during that time, but my belief is that there started to become a greater invasion of Western ideology, Western presence, especially with the oil. A lot of areas there started to feel a little threatened and probably amped up some of the traditional values and some of the expectations. And, using women usually is the easiest way to go. But I'm not a scholar of the religion. I was raised Muslim. I do not practice Islam. I don't practice any religion. I'm not a scholar in the sense that I can tell you all the details. I can tell you that there have been many interpretations of the religion. I'm very well versed in how it was taught where I grew up, which was fundamentalist. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I would think would be the closest reasoning behind differentiating what that was. Was it tradition? Was it religion? I think it was just a combination of all the things that then tied very much to, obviously, politics and power and all of that, which we don't necessarily need to get into, but they do definitely intertwine very, very comfortably.
Right. So is the purpose of this veil to keep you from the gaze of men? Is it to keep you invisible, like you said? Or what was your interpretation of that as a 10-year-old?
Well, my interpretation was what I was told, which was we are temptations to men. We are, if a man feels any kind of temptation, which he naturally will, it is the woman's fault because she is providing that temptation. Not only was I visually a temptation, but so was my voice. If I were to speak in public, my voice was considered by the, again, religious interpretations as blasphemy. So it's a sinful blasphemy, temptation, all the labels that you can think of. So it was essentially a sexual tool, the voice of a woman. So the minute a woman starts covering and menstruating, that's when she then becomes a temptation to men. It always was tied to men and sexual pleasure and, sin.
Wow. Was that confusing to you as a 10-year-old? Because I'm assuming they also didn't teach you about safe sex or consent or boundaries or any sort of sexual education, yet they're also at the same time objectifying you and telling you that you need to be covered or else you're going to tempt a man. Did you have any understanding of what that meant?
Again, I was lucky because I had an incredible parent at home, my mom, who was, Western and had a different education and different mentality. And even though she tried very hard to make sure that she wasn't necessarily exposing us to things that we shouldn't be troubling ourselves with, we talked about it. We talked about, sex education and how where babies come from and all of that, because nowhere else would you be talking about that. No, society only told you that you basically, your goal was to grow up to be a proper woman, a virgin, extremely pure. And then, when you're blessed with the perfect husband, that's where you just kind of give yourself to that husband purely and fully and committedly, and then, have children and raise a family. That was pretty much what was inculcated in my mind growing up, was this is what the goal, and this was not from my home. And I will say, I think the hardest thing for a lot of people is where they grow up in these types of societies. It usually is in the home as well. My conflict and where my story ends up being a little unique is that this was not the norm in my home. It was the societal norm, which put pressure on our family to perform and to respond to what the expectations were, which made it 10 times more confusing for a child like me.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think my biggest problem with this is just the sexualization of a child, of a 10-year-old. And it seems like, from my perspective, once you give this child a veil, it's almost like a target. Like, now they're supposed to be aware of themselves in a way that could entice a man. And it bothers me because they're just a child.
Absolutely. Yes. And I will say that from the age of probably about 12, 13, that's, again, when I was growing up, that's all girls talked about, was just when the moment would come that the right, person would come and propose. And again, these are arranged marriages also, for the most part. Those who were not, the marriages that were not arranged were definitely secretly set up, if you will. But traditionally, marriages are arranged for the most part between families. And that's what kind of girls aspire to. Now, I will also say that it is a very educated part of the world. Women are educated. They do go to school. They do go to high school. Many of them go to college. When I was in high school, that definitely was what a lot of the girls around me, my friends, were thinking of, that junior, senior years, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get engaged. I need to be exposed. I need to be out there. So essentially, yes, they don't talk about sex necessarily, but it is the value you place upon yourself is how you will then become the product that is meant to, be given to a man.
Yeah. Growing up with a mom who was more on the progressive side because of her upbringing, obviously, and she was kind of forced to conform into this way. You said she was really happy to live that lifestyle. Did you notice any sort of conflict or back and forth in her mind of wanting to maybe dress a certain way but not being able to, and kind of feeling stuck, or did she just fully embrace it?
Oh, that's such a great question. So my mom, I think aesthetically, none of the traditional norms bothered her. I mean, even though she was raised in Florence from, the infancy, my grandparents, my Italian grandparents, are from the South, so a lot more traditional. And so she grew up with a pretty traditional dad, my grandfather, who was, very modest and did not put up with a lot of, progressive or liberalized behavior for women. But so the clothing and the aesthetics, I don't think bothered my mom. I don't think she was troubled by the veil. I don't think any of that bothered her, how she dressed or how she conducted herself. I think where it became a little challenging for her was in the time that she was thinking more, like the intellectual stimulation. My mom was also a product of the New Age wave, so she was really into a lot of the New Age teachings. So cults in different ways, but and I subscribe to a lot of the new age schools of thought very cautiously, but there was a lot of interest in a lot of those very mind opening approaches to conversation, to self realization, to purpose. And so I think that's where she struggled a little bit. It was more of the intellectual stimulation that she was seeking, and the freedom to be able to talk about some of these things, because it is very taboo. You do not question anything relating to religion. When I was growing up, you could not talk about any other religion or philosophy or way of thinking. It had to be all exclusively tied to fundamentalist Islam. So for my mom, it was growing up, I didn't, I knew there was something off, but then when I was a teenager, we talked a lot more about it. And she did give me a lot of opportunities to just vent my frustrations or my concerns, but it was always like, in this room with the doors closed, we don't go out there, talk about this. Do not, don't share these thoughts with anyone else.
Okay. So what were some of those thoughts, frustrations, and concerns as a teenager that someone who living in that area would have to deal with?
Well, the fact that every summer we would go to Italy and see boys and see life, open and free, still very, very on a very short leash next to our dad or our brother or, our mom. It wasn't like I was dating in Italy or running around with boys or anything like that. It was definitely very watched, but I could see a very different life. Of course, we watched American movies, we watched TV shows, all of that. So I knew there was a world out there that looked a certain way. And then I knew what the reality of my world at home looked like, which was deeply devastating, not just for a teenage girl wanting to meet boys and get to know boys, but also just for being able to express my thoughts. I questioned a lot of things about the religious teachings. I was very, very enamored with dance and music, and I just absolutely loved playing music. But then in the fundamentalist teachings, they tell you that music is a sin. So at every corner you turn, your teachers would say, no music, that's a sin. Haram, which is a sin. You can't play music. Every time the prayer call, we heard the prayer call, which was 5 times a day. You had to turn everything off. You had to adjust your behavior, your conduct. And then when you're in public, any way or even around just a group of women, you're watched and judged all the time if you're a proper Muslim woman or not. Have you started wearing a hijab? Because we cover because it's mandated by law. But the hijab, which is just where women cover their hair, it's a religious devotional act. And it is an act that once a woman commits to doing it, it becomes sort of her way of devoting herself fully to her, Islamic faith. Not all women openly or enthusiastically commit to that. I wasn't one that did. No one questioned it because they just assumed you covered when you went out in public. So no one knew who was, muhajjaba, wearing a hijab or not. And I know here they say hijabi. That is incorrect. It's muhajjaba. But then there's always that question, that pressure, at 13, 14. Oh, who's a muhajjaba now? Who decides to wear the hijab? So there was this competition of who was like fully devoting. And I felt always out of place because I just did not feel like I wanted to pray 5 times a day. I wanted to, wear the hijab. I wanted to not talk to guys or think about boys or, or wear long clothes all the time. None of that not only made sense to me, but it actually it was suffocating. It was suffocating and I could not talk about it.
Yeah. And all those things that you mentioned seem more of like the social side, but did you religiously believe in the doctrine?
No. I did not. And I always remember asking my mom, like, if there is a God, why would he be so cruel? Why would he create all these people? And then, well, first of all, why would God show you all these wonderful things and then take them away from you? From women, it was pretty much all of it. From men, it was like some of it. Because I will also say that, yes, a lot of this was hard on women, but on men too, because this is not a normal life for men either, even though they had the freedoms and, all and the power and all of that. But for women, especially in the hottest desert of the world, to be covered from head to toe just made no sense. I do not know the outside of where I grew up as much as, maybe men did or Western people did that they got a chance to travel and to see it, because I had to be covered everywhere I was. So that to me was really hard, was coming to terms with the fact that I was to be completely quiet, submissive, silent, invisible. And then also to be told that, you're putting in all this work at school, but pretty much there were only 3 or 4 professions that were allowed for me to explore, teacher, because they needed teachers for women's sections, working in a bank, which was also segregated. There was a women's section and men's section. So if you're doing business, you needed to be able to talk to women, doctors and nurses. That's pretty much it. When I was growing up, those were the professions that you could consider as a woman, and everything else was not available to me. So no other ambitions you could think of. So that to me was very tied not just to the culture and the tradition, but also to the religion, because it was all intertwined. If I was out and about with friends and let's say I had nail polish on, they would immediately say to me, "Oh, you're on your period." And I know you're wondering why the connection. Well, the connection is that when you pray 5 times a day, you're supposed to wash 5 times a day before the prayer. And if you have nail polish on, water does not clean your nails and does not penetrate every part of you to wash you properly. And so if a woman's wearing nail polish, she will not be cleaned properly to pray properly. And so you have to remove your nail polish, wash, pray, and then do it all over again. But when women are on their period, they are considered impure and unclean, and their prayer is not welcome. It is not received. And so women during their period at least get a respite from praying 5 times a day. But the reason why is very, very degrading. It's very, it's shaming the woman. You're on your period. No one wants to get close to you or touch you because you're essentially dirty or filthy. So during your period, so if women have their nail polish on, it's because they're probably on their period and they can't pray. They can't touch the Quran either. You cannot touch the Quran. I remember being in the classroom and we'd have to all study, we had a subject, we all had to study Quran. And all of a sudden I would see some of my friends grabbing the Quran with tissues because they couldn't touch the Quran. And we immediately know, oh, she's on her period because she can't touch the Quran.
Wow. Going as far as to saying you can't even touch a holy book, that must feel so isolating and degrading, like you said, and also embarrassing, even just as a teenager growing up in regular American schools, I would say that it was embarrassing. You didn't want anyone to know you were on your period. But when there's such an outward expression of what you can and can't do when you're on your period, that must have felt so embarrassing as a teen.
Yeah, embarrassing was probably the least emotion I was concerned with. I know that that's what some of my other friends who were a little more liberal like me, my sister, I think there was more embarrassment attached to it. For me, it was utter and sheer anger and humiliation. I felt so humiliated because I felt like I wasn't embarrassed that I had a period. I was humiliated that I was considered less than or not good enough just because my body was doing what it was meant to do.
Yeah. So these messages are really hitting home for you. They're really sinking in a way that is creating so much shame and guilt within your persona.
100%. Because at the same time, your mind is thinking about other things. Your mind is thinking about, what if this world is the world that I lived in? What if I just had the freedom? And, I will say there was a lot of sexual frustration, social frustration, all the things that normal teenagers feel. All of those were felt around me. I knew many of my friends felt that way. I knew that they made choices that were not the wisest, got themselves in trouble, whether it was, dating secretly or meeting boys or losing their virginity. I mean, there were some very, very concerning, corrupt and scary behaviors that were going on around me. I have no problem to confess if I ever fell into that, but I never did. I had zero temptation because I felt like I owed my parents to be, better than that. I felt like I did not want to necessarily, my parents were good parents and we had, a good home. And so, and I had a lot of sense of self-worth and dignity that I did not feel like going that extreme would be the choice. And I will say, I'm probably one of very few in my circle of friends that really held off on any kind of temptation. Some of them were as benign and as innocent as talking to boys on the phone secretly to literally losing their virginity. I was nowhere on that spectrum at all. I just really held it together with so much frustration and so much resentment because it just wasn't right. It wasn't normal. But I also didn't want to put myself in any kind of jeopardy because if that ever went out, a girl is destroyed. There's no future. There is absolutely no future. No marriage, no nothing. So, what is my best scenario here? And so I was very, very cautious with making decisions that were not going to be a detriment to myself, to my present, and to my future.
Can we talk about that more as far as the marriage being the sole purpose of a woman? Because it's seeming like, from what I'm understanding, is that if you don't get married, you're kind of stuck. And so, what is the trajectory of a woman? What are the ways in which she is supposed to follow in order to get assigned a husband, or the whole courtship process? And how would it destroy a woman if she were, let's say, caught texting and she weren't seen as pure or clean anymore?
Yeah, great question. And I always, and I mean, I will say this a couple of times here as well, that I speak to my experience when I was growing up there. We're talking 70s, 80s, and 90s. Things have changed in recent time. I am not speaking to what the current social appropriate, expectations are. I have no idea. So I don't know. I'm not speaking on behalf of now. I've been gone for 25 years. But when I was growing up, okay, so here's how it was broken down. Um, Girls went to weddings and funerals with their moms and their aunties and and their family and their friends, so that they could be seen by a prowling potential future mother-in-law or older sister, or because that's where they were looking for girls for
At
their males in the
funerals?
family. Oh yeah, at funerals too. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh,
Mostly weddings, because that's when you're usually all dolled up, is at a
yeah.
wedding. And then young girls who are not married tend to have, there's a time during the wedding where, and again, these are segregated, everything is segregated socially there. So there's a moment where, music is played, it's live music, it's very traditional music, and young women will just dance just to be seen. And usually it's the hair. The hair has to be really long and really flowy, and you really show the best of your essentially aesthetic gifts. That's how, girls are seen. So a mother-in-law, a future mother-in-law, a mother of a boy would see that, and she'd be like starting asking questions. Who is that girl? Who's her family? And so step one is, okay, is she aesthetically pleasing? Step two is, who's the family? Are they a family we're wanting to associate with or not? And so if it's like, yes, we do, then okay, great. Well, step two, is she engaged? Is she not engaged? And then the formality of proposal happens. Usually the mother goes and speaks informally to the mother of the male, speaks informally to the mother of the female, pays them a visit, and just says, there's language around it, but essentially it's like, we're interested in, maybe considering this pairing. And the moms don't say yes or no. They just basically take the information and then share with the dads, the husbands. And then if it's like, okay, everything is aligning, then the males have this kind of formal meeting where it's like the formal asking of the hand. If all goes well, in very traditional families, the girl and the boy never see each other, not until the night that they are going to sleep together.
Whoa.
This is in very traditional settings. And all of my cousins got married that way. In modern families, a little more progressive families, then the parents will allow for the bride and the future bride and groom to meet, to get to know each other, to have an engagement. During that time, though, they can only see each other and be together with a chaperone, either the mom of the boy or the mom of the girl. And so, for them to be alone and be able to basically go shopping and buy or rent a house or buy a house or whatever, and buy furniture and build a future together before they get married, they have to essentially be legally married. So they have to sign a contract called a milka, which means now we have transferred ownership of the child, of the girl, from her dad to her husband. And the word milka literally means ownership. The word melik is king, which means a king owns his kingdom. And so the word mulk comes from owning. And so this ceremony is called the milka. Some people make a big deal out of it. It's a huge party. Other people don't. It's just this legal piece of paper. And it's also very regional. Some areas do not do the milka at all. They just do it all at once. And during this time, they can kind of be together, but they do not sleep together. They are just legally together without being, in the eyes of God, sinful, because they're alone. And so then after that is the big wedding. But that's kind of the traditional path that was around me. All of my friends pretty much followed that path. I followed that path. Every young woman looks for that for different reasons, but that's pretty much the trajectory. I would say for the large majority, that trajectory is just what they're excited for, what they're looking forward to. For me, it was the only way that I knew I would gain some sense of freedom and independence, even though it was very minimal in comparison to the independence that I really wanted. But for the most part, I was able to at least have some say based on who I was choosing to marry.
Yeah. Something that stood out to me as you were telling that story is how at weddings there's music, dancing, and your hair is out. And I was like, wait, aren't those
Mhm.
all against the rules? And so is that kind of the one exception where you can be seen or where you're expected to be seen in some sort of beautiful, maybe even sexual way to attract a partner?
I am so impressed that you caught that, and I'm so grateful that you did, because music in and of itself is sinful only if there are string instruments. If it's drumming or vocal, it is not a sin. But
Huh.
any other instrument that is considered, I guess, Western instruments is considered a sin. Now, that's not to say that it's not available, because I don't know if you're familiar with the oud, but that's a very traditional Arabic instrument. It's very similar to the lute. There is music there. There have been, TV shows and movies and musicians and very famous singers, mostly men at the time. Now there's some women, but they played instruments. If you hit a wall with an Islamic scholar or a devout Muslim, they will tell you all of it is sinful. You can only use a drum and you can only use your voice. So at weddings, it was pretty much only vocal and drumming.
Oh.
That's the music that was there live in traditional weddings. Now, in modern weddings, they also had, recordings. So there was also more music, and it was all recorded. It was like, on stereo or DJs. At the time, DJs were a thing, and they were all women. So you would hear modern music played in modern weddings, but it was only women. And yes, they had to show the best of it's like you're saving all this for a reason. Now you get to flaunt it so that you can obtain that ultimate goal.
That's so interesting because I would imagine growing up in a society that from the age of 10 you were told that you are a sexual being and you can't tempt men, it would be a little bit scary to kind of take off that mask and to present yourself in a way that's opening you up to the gaze of men that could potentially be dangerous. Did you feel that way at all?
Yeah. So I personally did not feel that way because my parents had a very different approach to that circus, if you will. So my parents didn't necessarily put that kind of pressure on me. They did not necessarily make me feel like I had to perform or go out there and be found. Not at all. My parents actually were not of the idea that women should get married very young, that definitely not marry our cousins, because all of my cousins were marrying their cousins and all of my friends were marrying their cousins. So that was a line that my parents drew. So no cousin marriage, no getting married super young, fresh out of high school. So I didn't feel that pressure. That's not to say that during that time, from the age of 15, 16, people were not knocking on the door. Um, it sounds very conceited to say that, but that's just the cultural norm. That's just how they did things. It's like, okay, they're knocking on the door, and they don't necessarily want the marriage to happen right away, but they're like, oh, she's a catch. We're going to make sure that we can at least lock her in. And so I didn't feel that pressure because my parents didn't put that pressure on me. The pressure that I felt was in making a decision that would be the least of two evils, if you will. Evil is not necessarily the right word, but maybe it is. I felt the pressure and put the pressure upon myself to find that man that I was going to then allow to come knocking at my door, because he had to meet a standard that I had, which was he had to be modern. He had to be open-minded somewhat. He had to have, a somewhat similar approach to how my family views the world. I could not marry a traditional man that then expected me to just be, you know, barefoot and pregnant at home or at his service, just being the wife. So that's where I felt more of the pressure.
Okay. And how did you end up finding this man?
Well, yeah, so I do go into details in the book, but essentially a friend of mine who was also like me, mixed, her mom was British, her dad, Saudi, had a lot more of a freedom meeting guys and talking to guys. Her parents were a little more comfortable. My parents were definitely a little more reserved and traditional. And so she met this guy through family friends. I mean, again, it was like all the family, they met him, and he had just come back to Saudi Arabia after living in the US. His dad was a diplomat, his mom, both his parents Saudi. He was born in the US, and he grew up there till he was about 13. And now we're 16, 17. So he had just come back. And so when she met him, she was like, oh my gosh, I think this is the right person for Jasmine. Of course, when I met him, it was fine. I did not fall madly in love, but I thought to myself, this has to be the kind of man I have to end up with, because he kept saying he wanted to go back, or he wanted to leave Saudi Arabia, and he didn't want a wifey and an obedient woman, and like all the things. I was like, okay, this will be the right man for me. And so at 16, 17, I was like, okay, I guess this is it. And so for 3 years, we talked on the phone secretly. My mom knew, my brother knew, but my dad was, I didn't want to upset him. I don't know that he would have been upset, but I just, waited, because his biggest fear was that we would get married young for all the wrong reasons. And then we followed the trajectory of everyone else. His mom came and spoke to my mom. His dad came and officially proposed. We had our little formal engagement. We were chaperoned when we were together. We did the milka, that ownership ceremony, where I wasn't even involved, but the men were. And it's hard, because then there's the dowry involved. So it's almost like you're purchasing the girl. And my dad just did not like and conform to that. It was really hard for him. I was his first daughter getting married. And so I know it was emotional for him, but it had to be done. And so I stayed in that marriage for 6 years. We traveled a lot, but I knew I did not want to have a child with him, because I knew he was probably not going to be the man that I was going to be with the rest of my life. And there was a lot of pressure to having a child, because you're married now. His family wanted a grandchild, wanted nieces and nephews. And I just bought myself time, because if I had kids, I knew I would never be able to leave, ever, ever, ever.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned in your book in detail about the ways in which the marriage slowly started to change, and you didn't get the guy that you initially thought you were marrying.
Yeah, very much so. So the more time passed, the more we both matured, because we got married when I was 19 and he was 20. So children.
Mm-hmm.
So as we both matured, I was becoming more radicalized in my feminist belief and in my own sense of self-worth. He was becoming more attached and more traditional. So we definitely drifted apart deeply and immensely, because he was now starting to feel a lot more committed to the lifestyle, a lot more attached. He was doing well with his work. He was, very close to his family. And meanwhile, I was like, this is just getting worse. And thinking to myself, I mean, at this point, what do I have to lose? What do I have to lose? I cannot be here. I cannot live this life. And so we did drift apart, and I forcefully, wanted a divorce. And then in the meantime, I started plotting my infamous escape. My idea was to move to Canada, essentially to be with one of my childhood friends who was also in the book, and just kind of run away and go to her and then figure things out. But while I was plotting this escape, and while I was getting, my act together, I fell in love with an American man there. And that was beautiful, wonderful, and extremely difficult. And for all the reasons. First of all, because my family would have never ever been okay with me marrying a Western man. He was a lot older than me. He was not a Muslim. There are all these things, but at that point I was like, what do I have to lose? So I proceeded with my plan to leave, but then he became a part of that plan as well.
Yeah, and I want to get into how you were able to actually escape. First, I'm wondering, did your husband at the time know that you were kind of drifting away and plotting to leave?
So he and I talked a lot about leaving, period, whether it was to another Arab country that was a little more modern and progressive, or whether it was going back to the US, which is what he wanted. I didn't necessarily have an attachment to the US. I'd come to the US and visited with him. Like we went to Disney World and New York, where he grew up. But America was not necessarily my ultimate goal. Obviously I was attached to Europe and to Italy, but I didn't care as long as we were leaving that, oppressive environment. But again, as he got more comfortable in his job, and then his mom got really sick, and she was fine after that. But during that time, she really guilted him into, what if I die? I'm not going to see my grandkids. And it was like very dramatic, very, very typical, manipulative. And that really created a wedge between us. And, and the pressure of having a child. And I said, I flat out told him, if we had children, it would not be in this country. It would be in the West. I'm not going to have children here. I wouldn't do anything. And I said, I understand that, but I can't do that. And so that's how that marriage started falling apart. It was it was obvious to both of us. We just started to have very, very different goals. We recognized that we should have probably just dated and been probably girlfriend and boyfriend for a few years, a wonderful first relationship. He was a good man. He was a kind man. But our priorities had shifted completely. The way he envisioned his life was way more in alignment with the traditions and the culture. And he was also pretty religious, not to the extreme that he forced me to cover and, and abide by those really fundamental laws, but enough to where there was the expectation that I had to pray 5 times a day. There was the expectation that when we traveled to other Arab countries, I wore a hijab. Didn't have to cover my face or wear the cape, but I had to cover my hair so that I came across as a proper Muslim wife. That started to really feel very off from the original plan. And I just, I could not continue with that. And I look back and I think, wow, as young as I was, I'm kind of grateful that I had a sense of clarity that I did not lock myself in with having a child or really succumbing to all of his expectations.
Yeah. And I want to get into why it's such a big deal to essentially escape the country and the laws around that and why it's so difficult. Because as I was reading your book, I was thinking, oh, wow, there's a lot to this. You can't just get on a plane and go. So can we talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So women did not for the longest time have their own ID. My ID when I was growing up was always under my guardian, whether it was my dad, whether it was my husband. I did not have my own ID or my own passport or any of that. Eventually, I was able to get my own passport, but again, always under the premise that it is tied to my guardian's, legal status. So that's that. So based on that, women can't just up and go. There's no way for them to legally exist. Women didn't drive either. Didn't even start driving till 2018. I came in 1999. So during that time, there was no place for a woman to have any sense of freedom to go to any public office or to seek anything, even divorce. If you were seeking divorce, you had to have really, 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 really very valid reasons and have, it's impossible. It's just not set up for women to find, what's rightfully theirs. So what women needed was a written permission with a seal from their guardian that they have permission to travel, what that travel entails, where they're going, and how long they'll be gone. And so that was, and this is like, even if you're traveling internally, but especially externally, if you're leaving the country, especially. So based on that, I knew that I had to come up with a plan. I had to figure out how am I going to be able to put things together and essentially not get caught. Now, prior to me plotting all of this, there have been attempts that other young women have tried to escape. And the minute they got caught at the airport, they were sent back to their families. Some of them, honor killings were very much a thing. And in other cases, they just became prisoners of their own home and they became bound to a life of servitude in the home and never be able to leave, not even to go to school or work or anything like that. So that has happened. It's been, it's been documented. It's happened. It's practiced. It's happened to lots of women. So there's always some kind of risk in putting yourself in a situation where multiple sources will come down hard on you. Now, in cases of women that have families that are somewhat progressive or, really invested in the well-being of the daughter, they will not kill them. But it is a huge shame for the family. Like the family then has to live with that shame, with that. So there are very few cases where some of my friends growing up, their dads were a little less concerned than my dad was. And they were like, whatever, we will send our daughters abroad to go to school. So they would sign the permission, send them to school. Many of them were educated in the US and they, they lived a fairly, normal life, if you will, as normal as can be, going back and forth, but still having that freedom. But that was sanctioned by the dad, by the guardian, by the family. And it was frowned upon. I mean, those girls definitely, society talked about them. And so my dad always was afraid of being the butt of people's, not just joke, but criticism and ridicule. And so that was never, ever, ever an option that I could have ever entertained. Can I go to school abroad? No, absolutely not. This is your life. This is what we're doing. And so for me, I had to get really, really creative in finding ways to get that permission without him knowing what my ultimate plan was.
Right. So what did that look like? How did you, I mean, I know because I read that part of the book, but how did you trick him?
So essentially what I did was I took advantage of the fact that I have family in Italy And my oldest Italian cousin is like my brother. We're very close, still are today. I told him everything. I told him what was going on, that I was planning to run away, that I wanted to start a new life, that now I'm divorced from my Saudi husband. So I'm essentially damaged goods. No Saudi man is going to want me unless I'm a second or third or fourth wife, because polygamy is still alive and well and practiced there. So I would be like a trophy second or third wife, even at the age of 25, but you are no longer a virgin. So again, you're not the desire number one, which I would have never, ever been okay with. And I also told him, and in the meantime, I also met this man and fell in love with, and I do want to run away with him. And so what we did was my cousin called my dad and said, hey, Jasmine, is going through a hard time with the divorce and everything. And, she just needs a breather. And my cousin said, I'm going to go to the US and travel with my family, with his partner. And since Jasmine's been to the US before, maybe she can go with us and just like get a little vacation out of it and also show us around and everything. And because I needed a visa to the US. Otherwise I could have just gone to Italy. My dad would have probably been okay with me going to Italy to visit my aunt and uncle and my cousins, but I needed that visa to the US because I was running away with my now love of my life. And that's how we plotted that. And so my dad was a little hesitant, and he talked to my mom, and my mom's like, oh, I think it's a great idea. Now my mom knew a little more to the story. So my dad agreed. I had to get my passport. I had to get the visa. I had to get the letter from my dad, and I had to get, a return ticket. 2 weeks is what I got. Went to Italy, spent time with my aunt who was dying, really. She was not well. And then after that, I got to the US, called my family. I'm here. It's all fun. It's great. And then in that 2 week time, as expiration time was getting closer that I had to return, I told my dad, I found a school here that's willing to give me a full ride scholarship. And this was true because I was going to college. I found a school and everything. And my dad is really big on education, as you can imagine, because that's how his life started. And so he was like, okay, all right, well, what does that mean? 6 months. And I literally said to my dad, I have no future right now in Saudi Arabia, except for maybe a career. So let me get educated and then come back. And that's how I got him to agree. And so I bought myself time. And then at the expiration of those 6 months, I told him I actually met someone. I fell in love. I didn't tell him that I met him in Saudi Arabia. But that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That's when my dad was like, okay, nope, too far. Absolutely not. And then I became pretty much dead to my family for 3 years until my first child was born.
Oh, wow. You just covered a lot of ground.
Yes, I know.
I want to rewind
Okay.
because you tell the story so well in your book in the airport and the feelings that you were going through. I really want people to understand the high stakes that were happening when you were trying to actually just get on the plane.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I 25 years ago, and still every time I relive that moment, it's the anxieties in my body still. It never goes away, no matter how much therapy and EMDR and all that good meditation, all that good stuff you do. That moment will never, ever leave my body, because I've watched movies, I've watched videos, I've read stories, I've heard about that crucial moment where that woman is in that line ready to get on the plane. And it's a matter of you're caught or you're free. And I was standing to wait to get through that moment. And keep in mind, in the airports, again, I don't know what it's like now, but when I was there, the airport was, all the TSA folks were men. And then there was a room that they would pull all women to, where you would be inspected by women agents. Everything is segregated. And so you would walk into a room and they touch you from head to toe. And I don't know what they're looking for. I mean, explosives, I don't know. Maybe they were just following what they thought was the right thing to do, but you are groped essentially from head to toe. In that moment, of course, I had nothing to hide. I wasn't worried about hiding anything. I was just afraid that they were going to ask me too many questions and I would slip an answer and say something that would get them suspicious. My mom was with me at the airport to see me off. No one in my family knew that I was going forever. Of course, I said goodbye to everyone like I was going to see them in a few weeks, which that alone was the torment and the pain.
Yeah.
'Cause I was close to my family, very close to my sister. I left Valentino, my dog, behind. And so I sat down, and in that moment, right before I boarded the plane, I saw a group of, and we did not talk much about them, but they were the most terrorizing group of people growing up, which are the religious police, also known as the Mutawa, who are devout men who implement the fundamentalist, or the most fundamental extremist practice of Islam. So they are out in public chasing women, yelling at women, chasing young men. They are monitoring every behavior of young people in public. Women have to be covered from head to toe. If they hear your voice, you get yelled at. If they see skin, you get yelled at. They will drag you into their suburban vans and take you to jail. So that, we did not touch upon that, but that was the constant daily, which is why I never like to go shopping or be out in public, is because you are always at risk of being seen by them. Now, visually, you can spot them a mile away because they have long beards. They wear the headdress, they wear their cape, which is a mishlah, and the dress that they wear, what men, Saudi men or Arab men wear, it's called a thobe, goes down to your ankle, but they wear it above the ankle because they refer to that as modesty. So you can tell from their short dress, their beards, the way they talk, the way their language, all of that. And so again, you can spot them a mile away. That was, to me, the most traumatizing visual of my life growing up. It was the scariest thing I could look at. I'm not going to make comparisons, but I'm sure other people in history have had similar, feelings towards other people that were a threat to their well-being and their existence. So in the airport, right before I was about to board, as they were calling my flight, they were walking literally right in front of me. And I thought, oh my God, they know I'm here. They know who I am. They're here to get me. And I froze and almost started having a panic attack. And my mom, who is amazing, grabbed me, pulled me close to her and whispered in my ear, get on that plane and just think you will never have to see them and deal with them ever again.
Yeah.
And so that just kept me breathing. I got on the plane. The minute the plane took off, I was like, okay, now I know I'm finally free. And I took the veil off. I took everything off. I basically stripped and just felt like, okay, maybe this is it. My first spot was obviously Italy, which felt like home, and I was with my family. But those 15, and this is not like now where security is long and drawn out. It is a short period of time, but man, it is so intensely, horrifyingly scary.
I can't even imagine that feeling, that anxiety, just wanting to be free, knowing that you could get caught at any moment. But luckily, your mom was on board with that. That's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And one of the things is also, I knew that once I left and once I landed wherever I was landing, all Saudi citizens are required to also go and, connect with the embassies and just kind of let their presence known in whatever country they're at. And probably some of it is formality so that if you need help or if there's any, it's just a diplomatic gesture, I guess, that many countries do. I just went under the radar. I just did not want to be seen or noticed, so that was a big piece also for me, which is why I think it ended up being a smooth process.
Okay. When you got to Italy, you said that you had removed some of the things like the veil and your different clothing. Did you put it back on because you were meeting family who knew what you should be wearing?
Oh, no. So in Italy, I never dressed like that. I was always with my Italian family. I always wore, jeans and t-shirts. And in Italy, I never had to be veiled. My dad, thankfully, was not an extremist. So in Italy, we dressed normal. Now, we dressed modest. I couldn't wear shorts or, tank tops or bikinis or anything like that. But, I was dressed Western. I did have my veil and my abaya with me because I intended on having that and just kind of having a ceremony for myself and burning it for my healing process when I knew the time was right, which happened a few months after that. But I never put it on again ever after that.
Yeah, a literal shedding of layers to your new life, to this basically rebirth. And I want to talk about what that was like when you actually settled in Wyoming with the love of your life, Daryl, and what that was like for you kind of settling in.
Well, I always joke and I say when we arrived, so we arrived in New York first, obviously, because we met in Milan. And then from Milan, we flew to New York. And then from New York, we flew to Denver and then drove from Denver to Wyoming, Rock Springs, Wyoming, which is a small mining town in the middle of the desert. So as we were driving into Rock Springs, Wyoming, I literally looked. Now, in my head, freedom also included trees and water. And I grew up in the middle of the desert of Saudi Arabia. And I was like, oh, I'm going to have trees around me and waterfalls and rivers and lakes and mountains. And I was just envisioning, because I love nature so much. And we're driving into this drier desert than even Saudi Arabia was. I literally looked at him. I was like, "You took me from the desert to bring me to the desert? Are you kidding me?" I mean, that was the big joke. But it was great. We landed in this fabulous little mining town. We were there a few years. I went to college there initially, community college. He worked there, and then we moved to Laramie, which is a lot more progressive and has the university town and everything. But I think that I would say the hardest, most unpredictable process of adjusting was that I arrived in 1999 and I thought, okay, this is it. I'm going to be able to slowly, but I also had so much shame, and I was so embarrassed to tell people what I came from, what my life was like, the fact that I ran away. Like, I just wanted to be normal for once. So I really struggled with how curious people were and the questions that they asked and how intrigued they were. And so I treaded very, very lightly, also because at that point, my relationship with my family was a little, on edge. But what I could not have predicted was 9/11, because right after that, within 2 years, 9/11 happened, and my world turned upside down, because whatever trauma was associated to my identity as an Arab, as a Middle Easterner, as a, raised Muslim, was now the greatest target in the country, because 9/11 just put a whole new process into play, and a different spotlight on the entire region and people from that region. And so that's when my life really turned upside down, in the sense that, where do I belong? I just can't see a way forward. Even now with the gained freedom that I've had.
Yeah. What was that like? Did people treat you differently, discriminate against you?
So I was very lucky, because the community college I went to, everyone there was so thoughtful, so sensitive. I know when I say I lived in Wyoming for 10 years, people are like, Wyoming? And I'm like, literally, it was the most wonderful state. The people are wonderful. It's a very, very sweet kind of, everybody somewhat minds their own business, but also is very communal when it comes to service. So I did not face any discrimination in Wyoming itself. However, there were a lot of people around me that had no idea what was happening, what that part of the world was. I mean, there is a lot of ignorance, unfortunately, in the United States, in many regions, that I felt obliged to come out of my secret dark cave and talk about my experience, to make sure that I was helping people differentiate between the people of the area, the Arabs, many Muslims. These are normal, kind, nice people, and all the other, problematic fundamentalist ideologies that take up so much space and create victims, not just in the region, but outside of the region. And so it was a really, really tough position to be in, to be able to advocate for a part of the world and an area that I just left and wanted to leave behind, but at the same time felt guilt in just allowing so much hate and so much prejudice and racism and Islamophobia, all of those things. It was a really tough position to be in. I could have never, ever imagined.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be really difficult to figure out your identity. Like you said, you just left a whole world behind that you didn't want to be a part of, and now you're kind of defending it, but then you want to become a part of the United States, and then you still have this Italian heritage. So how did you kind of navigate that and come to a place where you really found your identity as Jasmine?
Oh my gosh, that is the $1 million question, because it's the reason why I spent most of my education and professional career in identity research. Because we're witnessing this even here now in the United States or in the Western world. And it's the reason why I wrote the book. I wrote the book not because I wanted everyone to know my story. I actually never wanted to write my book. I never wanted to tell my story. But the pressure of being part of the conversation in a really transparent, authentic way, and giving permission for people to say, it's hard to navigate these different identities. It's also hard to just say, you know what, this is who I am, or this is what I believe, without the fear that your tribe, your village, your community will shun you. We're seeing that every day now in the world that we live in, where if you do not conform fully ideologically to whatever group you belong to, then you are shunned, you are silenced, you're censored. So many people decide to just adhere to the mob mentality. That's what I grew up in. So for me, a big part of that was, I will never have an identity that is traditionally, subscribed anywhere. This is a very bizarre and unique life that I've been offered. How do I make the best of it? How do I uphold some of the values that I believe in, that were given to me by my parents, by even my culture, and mix them with the values of both my cultures, obviously, and mix them with the values of who I, as someone that has been through so much challenge, can then morph it into something that is actually productive and helpful to society.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we are one-minded and one-sided, that will never happen. And I think for me, a lot of that identity and searching happened obviously after becoming a mother and having that sense of responsibility that now you are raising also human beings in the world that are seeing the world with fresh eyes. Do I want the world to tell them who they should be? Or do I want them to be able to freely choose and navigate who they want to be? And how do I do that and role model that when I didn't have that experience? So I don't know where to draw from. At the same time, I'm figuring it out now. So I say all this to say it is never resolved. I don't think it ever will be resolved.
Yeah, I'm sure it's really complicated. Did you find yourself leaning on Daryl for a sort of, I don't know, United States identity to kind of help guide you along the path of this is how things are done?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, learning about, insurance, banking, owning a home, owning things, a car, even just going and speaking to people. Like when I first arrived, he was like, okay, you're going to go sign up at the college. And I was like, me? No, what? No, you have to go with me. Because I'd never done anything alone. There was always a man either doing it for me, not doing it with me, because I never went to any office or anything. So I was always at the mercy of some male doing something for me. And so when he was like, no, you're going to figure this out. You're going to do this. And we're talking about a young, very strong-willed, independent woman. But you put me in that situation at the time, I was oblivious to the system. And I think what really scared me at the time was saying, I don't know, or I have no idea, or I'm an immigrant. Now I have no problem saying, I have no idea how this works, or, there's very few things now as an American that I don't know. In terms of the system, obviously there's a lot of things I don't know, but in terms of just systemic, things, I'm 25 years in, I would hope that I've got a foundation, but that was really hard. Being able to say, I have no idea how this works. I don't even know what you're talking about. Where do I go from here? That was really, really hard. And of course I leaned a lot on him, and I would say leaned on him. Yes, but also I fell into the trap of allowing him also to take a lot more charge than I probably should have, because again, I fell a little more into that trap of, oh, I have to depend on him. And that, that was an adjustment and a learning curve as well.
Yeah. So when you left and your dad found out, you said he was upset that you weren't coming back. He's like, oh no, this is too far. Did you have to face that ostracization from your family or that break in communication, or did they still allow you to maybe come and visit them or talk to them?
No, I have not been back since 1999.
Whoa.
I've not gone back. I've not gone back to the region at all. The family that who has come to visit me, I've seen, and for now, I mean, I've been in touch with most members of the family. I have not seen my dad. My dad passed away in 2018. I only saw him after that on FaceTime and Skype and things like that. But I never hugged him again after 1999, which of course is a deep pain.
Mm-hmm.
But I invited him many times. I would have loved for him to have come and, visited and met my children, his grandkids. And, I mean, my oldest son is not mine by birth, but essentially is the oldest grandchild in the family. And my first child by birth is also the oldest grandchild in the family. And my dad never got to meet them in person. So no, I did not go back. It took a little bit of time before we were able to really get to a good place. But now I'm very close to the members of my family who I'm close to. We're very close. And, we've all grown, we've all learned, we've all realized that the decision I made was not a selfish one. It was really even giving freedom to the family to break from the brainwashing of the system. Because we're not doing anything wrong. We are good people. We are educated people. We are, we have decent morals, and none of us were seeking a, corrupt life. We just wanted
Something
normal
different.
freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about your mom? Was she able to come visit you?
Oh yeah, my mom's come and visited many, many times. She's has a great relationship with her grandkids. She knows them all. She comes and goes. She travels. She's still, healthy and moves. And she is in Saudi Arabia now. And but she goes to Italy. She's visited here, so she's definitely mobile because she's got kids all over. So I have my siblings as well who are in different parts of the world or travel a lot. I mean, we are nomads for sure. So we come and go. I'm probably the one that surprisingly ended up being the most stationed.
Yeah, that's so funny. So you mentioned off camera that for a woman to get permission, she has to go to her guardian. So in your mother's case, are things different now to where she doesn't need permission to fly and come and visit you?
Yeah, so now things have changed, but up until a few years ago, my dad always had the letter for her. I mean, he never questioned it. He gave my mom a lot of freedom to come and go. And so, yeah, she traveled without any issues and my dad would grant her that permission. And now she doesn't need it now because I believe things have changed. But if she were to need it, I have my brother and it wouldn't be hard for her. No one ever stood in her way because, she was the matriarch, she's established a very different relationship. For me, it was different because I was more of a threat. I was a young girl. I am the Arab woman. I am the one that had expectations placed upon me in a different way growing up. Yeah.
So you just said, it just stood out to me. So your brother, your mom's son, would have had to give permission for her to go somewhere.
Yeah.
That's so wild.
Yeah. And this is not just as a man, because he's a man in his 50s now. This is like when he was a child also. Like if a woman does not have a husband, if she's a widow or doesn't have a brother, the son becomes her guardian. Absolutely. Yeah, it just slipped casually, but that is, I guess, a little bit of a shocker. Yeah. So a woman's guardian is whoever the male in her life is the closest to her, who is a legal male. So essentially a male that she is either married to or cannot marry, like a father, a grandfather, a son, a brother, an uncle. Those are the men who would be her legal guardians.
Okay. So if you don't have any men in your life, you just can't travel. Well, at least back then.
Well, the court will appoint one to you because you do need a male guardian to do business.
Okay. Wow, that's so interesting.
Like I said, at the time, anything a woman needed done, whatever it was, required, some level of interaction with society. And that interaction with society had to be done by a male.
Okay. Yeah, so it makes sense that when you got married, you were still kind of reliant on that. And that's all you really knew or all that you've seen and witnessed growing up. So do you want to talk at all about that relationship and kind of how it ended and where you are now?
Yeah. So I raised my kids in Wyoming and, for the most part, obviously life has been wonderful. I think one of the things I really wanted to do in highlighting this conversation. So I will also preface and say I am obsessed with cults and I know everything about cults. I've studied every single cult there is out there. I have even done a lot in my graduate study on cults. And someone brought your podcast to my attention because they knew how, and they were like, I think you really need to have a conversation here. And the reason why is because I love how you address the conversation. There's a lot to learn about what happens in these cults. And I think people think of cults as only the weird leader that does strange things. And, they don't associate it to anything beyond what we see maybe in hippie, communes and things like that.
Yeah.
And the truth is a cult can be just as small as your home, your family.
Mm-hmm.
What I think is the hardest thing to wrap our minds around is people that have had experiences with any community, ideology, framework that resembles control. You will never rid yourself from it forever, 100% ever. Because every time you turn around the corner, you are processing how that will impact not just you, but everyone else that is part of your world and your circle. And I think that's been the hardest thing for me. So in my time in Wyoming, I lived those 10 years always preoccupied with how my decision or whatever choices I was making would impact my family or my cultural origin or, back home. And now the internet was becoming a thing. And so I lived in fear all the time. And then of course 9/11 happened. And so then that traumatizes your psyche and your dreams. Almost every dream I had during that time was, Osama bin Laden coming and grabbing my kids or taking me and taking me back to Saudi Arabia and leaving my kids here. So it penetrates your psyche in a way that you can't rationalize, because you're like, I don't have to have these fears and these worries. But I think when you are very subtly and subconsciously degraded and oppressed, it's a lot of work to normalize your existence in a world that now has accepted you. And I urge people, when they interact with folks from different backgrounds, different communities, immigrants or just different traumatic lifestyles, that there's some grace in recognizing that we don't all have to succumb yet again to one ideology. So we don't all have to succumb to this, incredible open freedom ideology, even though it's the ultimate goal for many of us. But for those who don't get to it very easily, it's hard. For me, my freedom was my number one priority, but my intellectual freedom stayed imprisoned for a long time. And during that time, I know it impacted my marriage with Daryl. It impacted how I was raising my kids and how I was thinking of that. I wanted everything to be perfect. I did not want to address the things that didn't seem like they were right. I did not want to draw a lot of attention to what was imperfect, because I was like, I did all this, I sacrificed all this, and now there's problems. Who am I to complain about problems? Life was so rough before. Look at me, I'm here. Like I don't have the right to complain. I don't have the right to adjust or to seek what's best for me. And so those 10 years in Wyoming were beautiful and rocky and challenging. And of course I wouldn't have it any other way, but it definitely impacted the relationship with Daryl, because also he had his own demons that he had to work through and overcome. And so that marriage ended at a time that I knew had to end, because I knew that I was going to go down a really challenging path, because Daryl had a lot of his own demons and mental health issues. So the challenges of that marriage, unfortunately pushed me into making another drastic decision, much like I did before, where I had to leave the culture in which I grew up. I had to leave this marriage as well, because I had young children, I had concerns. And Daryl was definitely showing signs of mental health decline. He was bipolar. And I could not put myself once again in a situation where I would perhaps be locked in. And so after I left, I decided to leave the state of Wyoming. I moved to Washington State in the Pacific Northwest, because at this point, my sister was also leaving Saudi Arabia and moving to the US, and with my father's blessings, because now that I had done it, it was easier to give my sister her blessing, or his blessings to my sister. So she was moving to the US as well and coming to the Pacific Northwest. She had met an American man, and she was also moving on with her life. And so during that time, I decided to come to the Pacific Northwest. And a few months after I moved, unfortunately, Daryl took his own life, which thrust me into a whole new set of questions and grief, and how do you recover from that? But I will say it's really easy is not the right word, but when you have experienced putting your own life at risk, I think you can pretty much tackle anything after that. And that was, and then you become a mother, which I know a thing about that. When you become a mother, then everything in the world disappears and becomes transparent and pretty much non-existent. Your focus will only be the well-being of those children. And so, I started a whole new journey of rediscovery and a whole new version of freedom that was no longer the freedom of my social self, but my emotional and mental self, which was equally challenging.
Right. And how old were your children at this point?
So my oldest was 13, my middle son was 7, 8, and my youngest was 6.
Wow. So yeah, you're still in the throes of it in motherhood and raising your children. What was that like? Were you able to adjust well? I mean, what did you do for work? How did you make it work?
Yeah, so I moved out here, and at the time, this was several months after I had separated from Daryl. I also met someone who also was here, and it's someone I knew before, and we kind of just reconnected. It was a sweet friendship. It was a very supportive relationship, and neither one of us had high expectations of what this could look like, but we're like, might as well give it a try and just see how that goes. And he is my husband now, and a wonderful man, and the greatest partner, and wonderful parent to my sons, and has been a great anchor. And so I don't know how I would have done it if I was truly and completely alone and isolated in that, but I was able to come and kind of start all over and start fresh, and be able to really focus on what's best for my sons, and be able to, go back to school and get my education. And now, I have a wonderful career, and I'm very happy in the community that I live in, and I've made great friends, and all of that has sort of unfolded very, very, very softly and very slowly. But it is so rewarding. When they say stop and smell the roses, it really is true. If you are able to not just focus on the challenges that are sent your way, it can be very rewarding. And I've been blessed because I've had a lot of roses around me that have held me.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Your consciousness side of the story, how you got into advocacy work. We could talk about your podcast or whatever it is that makes you happy and brings you joy.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, so of course, what brings me joy is my children. And I know you know that, and that is very, very common and almost cliche, but I will say what brings me joy is really being able to have conversations with people where there is a beautiful spark of aha moment for everyone involved in the conversation. Even when I'm teaching, or when I'm advocating, or when I'm doing talks, I never leave just giving. I always leave receiving, keeping that open heart to be able to have that conversation flow in both directions. Nowhere like now do we need that more than ever. We are living in a very, very heightened time. And I know it's especially heightened in the United States, but it really is heightened all over the world. Thanks to social media, because it's done great things, but it's also created a space in which people have a lot of agitation and insecurities. And we talk about cults and ideologies, and the internet has only made that way more of an issue for a lot of people, because you can jump into any platform and get sucked into a mob mentality. Yeah. So part of the work that I do that gives me pleasure is to deconstruct a lot of that, is to work with individuals, both in organizations or in, on one-on-one settings, and really work through the process of deconstructing some of those very set, firm ideologies. I'm the director of DEI at a community college here. And so I'm lucky to be able really immersed in that work, where I can do it professionally, set programs for the students where we really talk about uncomfortable conversations, talk about challenging, topics, thinking of what victimhood is, what prejudice is, and is everyone potentially at some point in their life at risk of being targeted by that? And the answer is yes, every single one. Even people who we believe think have privilege, at some point in their life, they will either be targets of harassment and or, just hiding who they are because of fear of being harassed. So those conversations are very, very powerful right now, and they're happening, thankfully. I use my podcast, which currently is on hiatus, but I have, a really big library of wonderful episodes that I have interviewed. The podcast is called I Want You to Meet. And these are folks that I met, during my time in both work and pleasure, and acquaintances, or people that I've just admired from a distance. Maybe I watched a documentary of theirs, and I love their stories, and I love what they stand for and the inspiration that they bring. And they could be artists, activists, local community public servants, and just talk to them and talk about their journey and what they've done. So that's my podcast. And whenever I have the opportunity, I'm traveling, either offering some of these workshops at conferences and talks. And, I'm very, very available right now. It does keep me very busy, but it's very hard for me to say no, because I really believe in this work. I really believe that it's time to build bridges and to really have a space in which we can show up as ourselves, no matter what our belief system is, and validate that other people and their belief systems exist. I think the isolation of ideology and believing that it's the only right way is what's potentially going to be the demise of democracy in the world.
Wow. Jasmine, you're incredible. I bet it would be so great to learn from you. You're such a great teacher. You're so compassionate, well-spoken, and empathetic. And I think it's so awesome that you found yourself, that you did come into this identity that you've created for yourself, and that you're able to share your wisdom and teach and inspire through your book. So everyone go check it out, The Last Sandstorm. We'll put the link in the description. You have a website under your name, right? Jasmin Faulk-Dickerson. Your Instagram, jasmin.faulk.dickerson. Again, it'll all be in the description if you want to reach out. I've so enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing.
Thank you so much for having this platform and for inviting me, or for welcoming my invitation of myself. Thank you so much, Shelise. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last thing we need is your Linda Listen moment, your sassy statement as the viral video with the toddler goes, or something inspirational.
Okay, I love that you have this segment. So my sassy moment is never stand in the way of a woman that has her own identity and self figured out. Never, ever, ever.
Yes.
My sassy statement is, feminism is not a threat. It is the way to a balanced society.
Ooh,
I will also add and say that, if you belong to an ideology that tells you that you are right and others are not, and your sole goal is to not only impose your belief system on others, but to 100% spread it as the only ideology, run as fast as you can, even if it's just you. Mob mentality is really dangerous. We as creatures seek that community. We want to be together, and it's a wonderful thing when we come together for the good, and the good should be open and inclusive for all to exist. The moment that community starts to tell you that there's only one way of thinking, get away as fast as you can.
Absolutely agree. It's so much more empowering, and it gives you so much more possibility to just stay open-minded, to accept new information, to just be open to listening to new information. You don't even have to accept it, but be open to learning and growing and hearing other perspectives. It's just such a healthier place to be instead of this tunnel vision perspective. So absolutely love that advice. Love the Linda Listen moments. Couldn't agree more. Do you have any other final thoughts before we go?
The only thing that I want to say is, please, if you want to have this conversation more and you have a way to contact me, connect with me, I am always happy and eager to talk to folks who have any particular thoughts around this or questions, especially during a time now where people don't know where they can find information, understand Arab people a little better, understand the area a little better. Please don't trust everything you read on social media. Reach out to people who are really dedicated and devoted to helping people understand. And so I'm always happy to hear from folks. And so reach out anytime. And thank you so much.
Yes, amazing. Thank you for opening that door for people. It's really awesome that you're willing to continue the conversation. And guys, you can continue the conversation in the comments as well. We do love to hear what you have to say. Our guests read the comments, and it does help boost the algorithm. It's so great that we have this community here who does leave such encouraging words for our guests. Remember, they are real people. They're coming on and sharing their story. It's a vulnerable thing, and we just appreciate everything that you have to say. So if you want to support the podcast, again, interacting with the post is the best way to do so. If you want to support further, you could become a patron at patreon.com/cults2consciousness. Our newest patrons, Brandy and RS, thank you so much for your support. If you want to go to Costa Rica, unfortunately it's sold out, but you can leave your name on the wait list if you want to be notified for our next vacation. We have merch as well at cults2consciousness.com under the merch tab. Lots of different things to choose from. And if you enjoyed this video, I'll link 2 more down here below you can check out. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious and be well.